everyone, and welcome to CDNetworks CDN API Overview and Introduction to Scripting. I think I've got an agenda slide here. Let me get my GoToMeeting working. All right, so on the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about APIs themselves in terms of general background. I'm going to talk about some programming languages, do a little bit of data transfer, JSON and XML, how you can look at those things. I've got some coding examples to look at, and then there's a very specific CDN example that shows you from end to end how to pull data directly from some APIs. And at the end, I've got a slide of sample code. So I've put my sample code up on the internet for you guys to take a look at. Also have my contact information. If you look at the code and you got any questions, find any bugs, let me know. So CDNetworks has a full suite of APIs, everything from reporting statistics like traffic statistics to being able to flush the cache, to make configuration changes to pad settings, things like that, to get CDNetworks IP block if you're doing it for, let's say, for a firewall and you want CDNetworks IP block. Self-service allows you to go in and create accounts and sub-accounts and things like that. Cloud DNS and load balancer have just a different enough API that they start at a different base of the tree. But CDNetworks has a full suite of APIs. And today I'm just going to focus on one because I'm going to do a lot of background because APIs can be complex depending on what level you've started at in terms of your background here. So on the reporting API side, we've got a whole bunch of APIs just in that category. We've got content by types and by errors and by directories, things like that. And then there's edge traffic and dynamic and static and origin and response code, a whole bunch of stuff, as well as visitors by traffic and client and even contract information if you want to make sure that you're 100% matching your network traffic with your contract bill. We've got that as well. So I'm going to do a big example on edge traffic. It's one of the ones that everybody starts with, so I thought it'd be a good one to go about here. So let's jump into scripting. I'm sure some people have stronger backgrounds. Some people are looking at this on the first time, so hopefully I can do a good overview that gets everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about two languages, Python and Perl. I figured these are kind of the two most popular interpreted languages that people have been using for 20 years and whatnot. There's pros and cons, and I wanted you to be able to come away with this thinking more on the lines of I understand APIs and data structures, and then using Perl or Python or any other language you could jump to. So I'd like this presentation to work for any language when you get done with it. But what can I do for a quick scripting overview? The programming Python book is 1,600 pages. The Perl one is almost 1,200 pages. So that's obviously impossible to run through an overview of the languages. My favorite way of learning a language is using the cookbook and kind of the intro book. So the cookbooks for both Python and Perl are fantastic, and then the learning books are far easier to get a hold of. Those programming books are a little bit overkill if you're starting, but I've hopefully picked out enough of the languages to get you a feel for these data structures. And I picked Perl and Python both because they've been around for a long time. They have a ton of packages, both the comprehensive Perl archive network and the Python package index allow you to augment your language. So if you need to do CSV or connect to a database or export to this or, I don't know, do some kind of matrix manipulation, whatever you can think of, somebody's probably written a package for. So these are fantastic languages to do. They are dynamically typed languages, so they're really easy to do. Perl is a little bit more happy-go-lucky, weak type, everything goes. Python's a little stricter with you. It remembers that you've given it a type and helps you. And a lot of people like that, and we'll talk about some pros and cons for you guys to think about what language to choose. On the Perl side, we're going to talk about data types real quick here. And Perl uses these things called sigils, the $, the @ symbol, and the % symbol. Most languages don't do that. Python doesn't do that. and you'll see that it makes it sometimes easier to read and sometimes not. We're not going to get into the OO kind of stuff, but both of them support it, but they were written a long time ago, so they're not 100% OO languages. When you're looking at Perl and Python, one of the things that comes to mind real quickly is that every line on Perl has a semicolon to be the end, and it uses curly braces to separate out sections in the program that you're doing. Python, on the other hand, got rid of that. Kind of one of the first popular languages to do that, I think. And there are no semicolons, and you just use spaces to delineate the functions and the sections inside of the function. So I think Python kind of looks a little cleaner there. But when you hear people talk about the old C syntax, a lot of that is from curly braces and semicolons, and you can see where that comes from. Oops, did that a little quick. But for me, what I'd like to really focus in on are data structures, and I think the programming language is secondary. I'd like you guys, again, to come away with the idea that I'm thinking in data structures, I'm thinking about how I want the program to work, and then whether or not I end up using a scripting language or compiled language or whatever you want to do, that's kind of secondary. So there's three things that are important for most general APIs, and if you can get these three data structures down, you can really work with not just CDNetworks APIs, but really anybody's APIs out there. These are the core three ones. Unfortunately, the terms are slightly different, but it's usually easy to figure out what the language is calling it. So in general, we're going to talk about variables, arrays, and dictionaries. Those are the three data types. And a variable is the simple, straightforward one that I think most of us know just immediately, and that's just a value equals something. So you're setting a value to be the number one, or a value to be a string that happens to say one as well. So it's just a single thing. A variable is just pointing to one thing. So that's pretty straightforward. An array, on the other hand, is a list of multiple items. And that's if you can have a list of strings, you can have a list of numbers. And so I've got a list here of 1, 2, 3 as numbers, and I've got a list here as 1, 2, 3 as strings. And with the list, you might want to refer to the first one or the last one, or you might want to walk through all of the items on the string and do something with it. So there's a data structure for an array is really important to have, and you'll see that's going to come into play a lot for us. And then finally, the third data structure to really look at is a dictionary or a hash in some languages. And this is where you store a key and a value. And you'll give often, you know, a database record might be something that reminds you of this. But I've got a key, let's say first name, and it's John, and then the last name is Mac. And so I can immediately refer to any of those values inside of the dictionary. And generally a dictionary is going to be pretty complex, right? It's going to have everything associated with a customer account or a purchase that somebody had made or something like that. But you get three ways of storing things. You store one value, you store a list of values, or you store values that you've given the key value to, and then you look them up later. So how do a couple languages represent this? Between Perl and Python, you know, you can jump to anything else after this. In Perl, again, they use that sigil concept. So they use a $ in front of all variables. So I've got $temp is 91 or $temp is too hot. And Python doesn't use those sigils. And Python is much closer to most other languages. Python will see 91 for temp, and it's going to know it's an integer from that point on. And so it'll keep track of that for you and help you in the program. If you try to do something wrong, it'll catch that for you. Versus Perl probably won't catch that. It'll let you do whatever you want. And so the second one is a string there. On the strings, they're important even if they're just single values. Perl quotes make a difference. In Python and a lot of other languages, quotes don't make a difference. And really, I've got this nice little quote down here on Perl of there's more than one way to do it. It's not always an advantage. And so Perl's got this habit of letting you do things multiple different ways, and it makes it harder sometimes later to go back and figure it out, or if somebody else wrote it. But really quickly, if you use a single quote, that means don't interpolate. And even though last name is a variable and would have stored, let's say, Mac, it prints as John $ last name because there's no interpolation with the single quotes. Double quotes says, yeah, if that's a variable, give me the variable itself. So you print John $ last name with double quotes, you get John Mac. Single quotes are much easier in Python. You just print something and give it the last name with double quotes or single quotes. Doesn't make a difference. Though most Python folks seem to use single quotes, so I did that as well. For an array, this is, where you're just keeping track of things, of a list of things. You can see here we're just keeping track of a list of 3 things. I can create them. If you compare both sides, you can print them. They print differently. And I can grab the first one out of the list. So list sub 0 is 0 is John on the Python side, and array sub 0 is John on the Perl side. One of the difficulties with Perl is that even though array is an array, when I want a single value out of it, it's now a scalar. So now I have to go back to using the $. In and of itself, this complexity here is going to probably make me not recommend Perl for most people. I mean, if you know Perl, that's great. But if you don't, this can be enough of a confusion, the fact that the @ symbol changes to a $sign when you're referring to individual items, that it's, Python might be a better choice. Dictionaries is the same way though, in the sense that you can see how you're creating them, you can see how you print them, and you see how you refer to them, with that little caveat that Perl makes you go back because first and last are now scalars. You got to use the $. A little bit tricky. And again, the reason why I've got 2 languages up here is because I think it's more important to understand variables, arrays, and dictionaries than it is to understand how to use Perl or Python. Because you can look that up in Google, you can look that up in the book, but once you've got it in your mind exactly how you're going to pull data out of an API using those 3 data structures, the programming language is going to be easy for you guys once you get past that first hurdle. So I've kind of hinted a couple times of what the recommendation is, and for me, Python is a great first choice if you haven't done any programming scripting before. Perl can be a little bit funner. If I'm doing a lot of regular expressions, I can do it, but here's something I did for a different customer, doing some, I don't know, text processing, and I could have probably done it with some libraries and templates and stuff like that, but I used Perl to do it. But if you look at this, some of it looks a little bit like Greek, and the Python equivalent might have been a lot longer, but it would have been easier to read. So Python 3, great first choice, easy way to do it. Perl's a little funner, but unless you work with it all the time, you come back and look at your script and you're like, well, what was I trying to do? So good to know about both of those languages. And now in terms of transport mechanisms and data interchange formats, XML and JSON have both been around for a really long time. You're going to run into APIs from not just us, but from other vendors, and some will support one of these and some will support the other, and if you're lucky, you'll be able to have a choice. CDNetworks, you have a choice. We support both XML and JSON, and you'll see here I'm going to also have a nice recommendation as to what I think most people starting out should use. Now, XML looks a little bit like HTML, and that's because of the acronym there, markup languages. You can see it's pretty easy to read. Computer can read it, humans can read it, not a problem. But the first time you look at JSON, I think most people think, that's a little bit cleaner, that's a little bit easier to read. And you'll see that probably sticks with it. JSON was also developed later, often plugs into a programming language a little bit easier. than XML. XML can kind of replicate somewhat of a database a little bit more. So there are these trade-offs, but for business type APIs and connecting to other services, we don't need that much complexity. But you know, they all do the same thing, and you can see the same match between these ones here. So look at XML, just because it's a little bit older, first one to come out. You can see here that we're talking about John Smith up here on the top, first name, last name. And those things, if you think back to my 3 data types, I can store something in a variable, an array, or a dictionary. These things are, first name is John, so this is just going to be I can just save that in a single variable, or age is 25. Single variable could easily do that. On the other hand, when you scroll down and you look here, you can see that it's phone numbers, and then there's a phone number start and a slash, so it's a phone number end, 1, 2, I guess I got 3 of them here. So if you got a list of these things, this is now an array. So if you want to pull that out of the XML, now you got to be thinking of an array. So you've got a variable to maybe hold age, and you've got an array to hold phone numbers. And it gets even more complex because there's a type, which could be home or office or mobile, and then you've got the actual number itself. But well, let's look at that on the JSON side. So on JSON, we've got the same thing. John Smith, age 25, can pull out some variables there. Here with JSON, it's kind of nice using these. You know, it's not like it's somewhat like the Perl and the Siggles. They've given you indicators of what the data types here. So the square brackets are indicating here an array, just like the XML somewhat indicated an array. You had to kind of look at it a couple times. This is a lot more obvious that I've got an array of phone numbers. And then the curly brackets are saying this is a dictionary or a hash. So you can see I've just got one kind of straightforward example of data, and I've already had to use a variable, an array, and a dictionary to hold all of that data. And that's why I keep emphasizing it's the data structures and the algorithms that are important, and then the language, you know, we'll work that out. We'll just Google everything for figuring out the right syntax. So how would Perl do this? I'll run through it quick because this isn't my recommendation, but you know, if you guys look at this later, or anybody looks at it later, I want to have everything in there for completeness. Let's see, who's seeing my arrows? Oh, they were hidden. All right, so creating a new, you basically, in most of these languages, you create an XML object or a JSON object or a CSV object, and then you kind of work on them. So in this case, I've created an XML, I've imported my text in here, and I pull out first name, last name, and those are very simple. You're just saying that, you know, in Perl, it's a $sign because it's a variable. First name equals, and I pull it out directly from the XML. Last name, I pull it out directly. Phone numbers, again, Perl is helping you a little bit here, but it's going to take it away really quick. It gives you @phone numbers, so that's good. I'm saying that's an array, but now I've got to pull out phone numbers over on the right-hand side, which kind of starts out as a scalar, and then I'm kind of telling it to, you know, force it into an array or cast it into an array. And again, this can be enough of a reason why Perl is just not worth it as a first language. But if you get over the hurdle, you know, if you spend that amount of time to get comfortable with the $, the @ and the %, and being able to cast them back and forth as you need to, it is nice to look at this as a language. And then finally, we just print this out to the screen. For each phone number and phone numbers, you know, print it out to the screen. So pretty straightforward. All languages are going to do this. And for example, I didn't talk about how to do for each or a loop or an if test in Perl or Python. You're always going to have to look that up, right? You could either look it up in a book or Google it. Or any other language is different. We're really focused on the algorithms here, but you can see I've got the syntax for you to do that. Here's how Perl does it with JSON, and I think it does it cleaner. Again, JSON was really meant to import direct variables into each other. And you can see I'm creating a JSON object. I pull out the first name, last name. I got an array. Even the casting here looks a little bit easier than the prior example. And then you just loop through and print it, same old kind of thing. So that's I think a clear preference. If you do end up choosing Perl or you're an existing Perl programmer, JSON I think just makes it so much easier to do. And we'll see how to switch on JSON output using CDNetworks. All right, so my recommended language, Python. If you're using XML, now there's probably a bunch of XML libraries, and you can probably tell from listening to me that I'm not the biggest fan. So I just picked kind of the default one that looked like it was out there and didn't necessarily try to find the best one. But this is really representative of what traditional XML did. You were kind of searching through things. You didn't just directly import it and it knew about your data types. No, no, no. You had to do a lot more work and find things and loop things, and it was, I don't know, it's just not as clean. So in this case, I do create an XML object. I can find first name, find last name. Okay, that's not too bad. Print it out. And then here's the loop. This loop looks more convoluted than even Perl, and that's generally hard to do. So it's not really my recommendation. You can see that we're doing a search inside of the root to find the start of phone numbers. When I find it, then I know I'm starting an array. But I got to look at the child, and I got to look at the tag to make sure that it's the number. Anyway, not great to do. Fortunately, CDNetworks supports JSON, and this is what it looks like in JSON. And this is much clearer if you're trying to pull this data. Same example. I think I've saved the cleanest one for last. Create a JSON object just like you do in all the languages. And then first name, last name, phone numbers. No messing around with anything. Python knows that you've created a variable in first name, variable in last name, and an array in phone numbers. Some people like to put an S at the end of it, so it's phone numbers, and it just reminds you that you're kind of working with a list, working with an array with multiple items in it. But you do something that makes sense to you and be consistent with that, printing it out, of course. And then when you go through the loop, I've created there's a variable called phone number in phone numbers, and then I just print the number itself. So I think this is kind of the cleanest example, and if you had to work your way through on JSON, I would say this clearly shows why I have the recommendation that I did. Last little bullet. Okay, so now that we did the background on the 3 data types, we've got a really great foundation, again, not just for CDNetworks, but really for working with almost any other enterprise API out there. You're going to have a good shape. The first thing to know with working with CDNetworks API is that you got to make sure that the user and password that you're using has access to the data that you want. Now, the CDNetworks portal, you can segment certain users to certain paths and certain websites, if you will. So you just got to make sure that the user has access to that data. If you've just created it from scratch, you guys probably all have everything for your single user, so that would be okay. But if you don't have access, you're going to fail pretty quick. Then there's really 3 steps that you have to keep in mind. So these are the 3 big things to keep in mind using any CDNetworks API. You're going to call the login API, and it's going to give you back a session token. And that session token is only good for you, and it's a security mechanism that CDNetworks employs. So in addition to only connecting in HTTPS, so using encryption, we've got a token so that your data is protected as well. You use that token for the next API call to get your results. So for example, the traffic, or my visitors in Chrome, or my visitors from countries or something like that, right? You'll use that token and the API to get the results. And then finally, the third step is you call API, and you force that session token to be expired. Now, as a developer, you want to follow all the rules, and you definitely want to call the logout API. It's really optional. We're going to time out that token anyway, and so it'll become invalid after a short amount of time. But as long as you're making API calls and working with the system, you're not going to have an issue with that. if something did get expired, you just go back in and log in and get a new session token. So it's very easy to do. I got a lot of examples to show everyone here. When doing APIs, you know, REST-based kind of web APIs, it's really best to start out using either the browser or a tool, and I chose a Chrome app, might be the only Chrome app that I use, but a Chrome app called Postman. And in Postman, you can test out your APIs. So you'll put the API string, and I don't know if everyone can see my cursor. I guess it moves somewhat there. But you type in your full URL, and you can see the response, and you can see the key here, like session token. You can see the output is JSON. And if you've been following along closely with the data structures that we've been talking about, one of those data structures had a key and a value. It was a dictionary. So I'm pretty sure Postman is parsing out your URL values and storing them in a dictionary so it can reference them later. You can see dictionaries are used and arrays are used by everybody, not just web programming, but all programming languages have the concept of that. So this makes it really easy to do. You can also look at the bottom, and you can change the representation of the output. I think it's got like raw text and JSON and XML, and it'll just format and cleanly pretty printed out for you. So I always do this. As a matter of fact, I always test my API before I start coding it. It's just so much easier to do in the web browser or Postman, and then when you're sure you've got the API full URL down, then you can put it in the programming language. And again, it's just worry about the data types, worry about the algorithm, and then only at the end do the programming language. That's just syntax at that point. Here's the format of all of our APIs. We've got the service area. It's possible in years past the service area was different for different regions around the world, but everything is globally load balanced with CDNetworks, not just the CDN, but the API infrastructure as well. You got the service itself, so we're doing an API REST, and then the API name, which the first one is going to be login, and then you pass in some parameters onto that. We've got a full-blown manual, of course. Everybody's going to have a manual for their APIs. It is important to look at this, save you a lot of trouble. Here's what ours looks like. You can see that it's got a lot of details. This is just the overview. I've got the full request. Actually, I'm going to go backwards one page. If you look down at the bottom, you can see the full URL down there. And you can kind of copy-paste that into your browser. Of course, you have to change the username and password there, or it's not going to work. But here are the parameters that you pass in on the line. You have to pass a user and a password, and those are both mandatory. Optional is defining back the format, kind of the data interchange format that you want to receive, XML or JSON. And I think you've seen my recommendation in terms of doing JSON. XML is the default, though, so we're going to have to do something to make sure that every API comes back the right way, and that's output equals JSON. Now, in the return code, it would be super nice if the return code to log in was just a variable, and it just gave you the session ID. Unfortunately, it's a little more complex than that, and it is for probably most enterprise APIs that you're going to connect to, because we can have a hierarchy, a structure like directories and directories. We can have accounts and sub-accounts and domains and paths, all this kind of stuff. It's a little bit harder, but we've gone through the data types that you need to have. So we've got an array, which you guys know about now. And then we got the curly braces, and in this particular document, those stand for a dictionary. So we're going to get a session token, a service group name, and we don't have to worry about the identifier. I don't use that myself. Here is another important thing to cut out and post on the side of your cube. These are the error codes that you get when using the API, and 0 is going to be success. So if it comes back with a 0, which in some languages is false, that'll actually be success. That's pretty common in the API world. That way, you can reserve all of these other kind of positive numbers for longer descriptive errors. So you will get some of these, like if you log in incorrectly, 101, 102, if you've got some parameters wrong, it'll give you that. So make sure you have this, unless you get 0 in everything you do, you'll want to look up your error messages. So we've gotten to the first API here, and this is what it looks like. Again, I'm following my own recommendation. I'm going to do it in either Postman or I'm going to do it in the browser. I chose Postman. Here is the login command itself up on the top. I have, not that I don't trust you guys, but I kind of grayed out my username and password. You can see that it's up on top, and you can see the representation down below. And it's good to take a look at this now before we jump into the code. You'll see that there is a result code, and that's 0, so we know that that's success. And then you've got this thing called session with a square bracket. I'm thinking array at that point. Then I got a curly bracket. I'm thinking dictionary at that point. So that is an array of dictionaries. Again, a little complex, but there's only 3 you got to work through. Here's what it looks like. This is a little bit longer because it's the top of the screen, and this is the example that I've got. This one, the ones in the PowerPoint don't have too much error code, return code checking, just to make it a little easier. The one on the website's a little bit better, but you know, for use, you should always check everything on the return code. So I'm importing some standard stuff. That's easy to do. This is a Python example. And up the top of both of the scripts, if you look at the Perl one or the Python one, you'll see that there's these uppercase variables. And I kind of do them because they're meant to be constants that I'm just using throughout the rest of the file, and I want them to stand out a little bit more, so they're uppercase. So in the ones on the website, you'll see it'll actually say change or don't change for some of these things. But you're going to have to put in the user password. What I did is I created a file in the same directory, which that wouldn't be secure. I'd recommend putting it in a different directory. But again, this is just a test. So instead of hard-coding my username and password in the file, I put it in, hard-coding it in the script, I put it in the file, which you could have with different privileges. You know, you could protect those with different privileges so you couldn't get access to them. And then I just read it in. So it's a funky looking way of reading the file user or path and getting it in there. There's a couple of the constants. You'll see what those mean. They're not that important. I've got a general scheme of things that I do, which is I print the URL onto the screen. And the reason why I do that is because I want to go to the browser or Postman. I want to put it in and make sure that it works. Again, do your debugging outside of scripting, and you'll save a little bit of sanity. So I always print the URL out. I parse it. So this was kind of the example before, you know, where you're grabbing in the request. This time I'm grabbing it in from a URL instead of just a text string that I showed earlier. I make the call, and I get the results, and I look at the return code. Again, there's no error checking here. You probably would want to put an error and stop the script. The versions on the website do that, but for simplicity, I'm trying to keep these a little bit smaller. I'm going to keep track of that session token later in the script, so I've created a variable, and then I just pull it out in doing a loop. Now, when we were doing the loops before, we would just go through and print out every single one. In this case, I'm looking for a specific one that I want to log into. So if me, JMac here, if I'm got a pad for CDNetworks.com and CDNetworks is accelerating that and securing that, I want to refer specifically to that inside of, I got to look for that inside of the data that CDNetworks has in the API. So that's the service group. In my case, I've got it in here as CDNet internal, but you're going to have to change this. And this is just going to be whatever you've got in your list. You can, if you're not sure what it is, when you run it in the browser, you're going to get a list of all of them. but you only want one of them for at least the test that I'm doing. So here where I've got down at the bottom, if session equals service group, and the service group's in caps because it's my constant from above, I'm only looking for CDNet internal. I might have a different group or directory called CDNet performance, CDNet product management, CDNet operations. I'm looking for my own kind of directory. And so that's the only one that I print out. And that's why the loop looks a little bit different here. And I'm saving that session token because, again, you start with login, you grab the token, the session token, and you reuse that later. And here's what it looked like on my command line. You can see I'm running the example, and I print the control group, but I only print one of them. So this URL here, I could take this and copy it directly into the browser because I put it out there for debug information. That's my own little personal habit. The result code was 0. I'm good. And then I looped through, I might have looped through 15 or 20 different directories, but I found the one that matched the string that I wanted, CDNet internal versus CDNet operations or CDNet performance, and then selected the long-looking the long-looking value that we're going to pass along to the next one. So again, a little bit convoluted, but if you can get over that first hurdle, you've done everything. All of them are going to all work the same way, and all the rest are going to look the same. I could just end the presentation. They're all kind of the same thing, but I'm not. I'm going to go through the full list. And so now I've got, because again, there's multiple layers, the internal group or the performance group, we've got different web pages. So now I need to get the key for that web page, or that domain, if you will, CDNetworks. And this is one called Get API Key List. Works exactly the same way. I pass that session token in from before. You can see down here, I've got the session token in the output. I'm always passing output as JSON on the end. And now I get back a list of items. And again, curly brackets are going to be dictionaries, and there's an array of them. I had to chop off the square bracket on there, but you can see this is the one I want. So now that I got the browser working, I can now start to do the code. And this is the next chunk of the code. It just kind of follows underneath it. I do exactly the same thing, absolute creature of habit here. I print out the URL, and I make sure it works in the browser, because there's no point in writing any code if it's not working in the browser. In this case, I look for the return code again. There's no error check, but there is one on the web, where I posted it on GitHub for you guys to look at. I'm doing the same thing here. I'm looking for www.cdnetworks.com. I have got a global variable called API key that has that information in there, and I'm looping through. So before I was looping through looking for the directory. Now I'm looping through looking for the website name. And it's a little bit more complex, but because we support these directories and directories and directories, and the fact that you can have multiple properties, it takes a little bit longer to scroll through it. But once you got it, all of them are easy to do. So this is exactly the same thing. You loop through, you find the one that matches, and as soon as you find the one that matches, you know you can stop searching. So there might be 1,000 in the list, and if I find it after 10 searches, I break and I just continue out of it, and then move on to the next step. And you can see what this looks like on the command line of my Mac. It runs, it gets the initial code here from selected, and now it's getting the code for CDNetworks.com. So I found the directory, I found the website, we're all working good. This is nice and easy. All right, we're finally to the point. I've spoken over a half an hour. We finally get to that one little arrow called Traffic Edge in the performance section. Do the same thing again. We put the URL in the browser or Postman. We see the results, and now we find something actually interesting. This is real data. This is actual traffic happening for www.cdnetworks.com. I don't know if it's a test pad, test area, but this was real data that was collected from the CDN. And you can see there's a date time, 2017, 02, 0100 hours, 0200 hours. You know, it keeps going there, and there's a bandwidth and a data transferred value here. And you can see I've got all the things. I got the variable, I got the array, I got the dictionary. It's all being represented. Code itself, Looks very straightforward. I do a few extra things I'll show you. I am printing the URL out because I'm going to type it in the browser and make sure that it works every single time. I parse the return code, make sure that it came back as 0. No point in continuing if you got an error. And I'm going to create a little bit of graph for everybody on the call, a chart. So I'm going to create a legend and keep track of these in a list or an array. So the square brackets for Python are going to give me a list. And I'm just going to have the list times, you know, like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I'm just going to create them all in a list. Same thing with the amount of data transferred. I grab the traffic items. So this is a list. And then I am going to pull out from the dictionary and print on the screen date, time, and the data transferred amount. So this is, I think, bytes transferred. We'll see in the graph I did a better job of labeling it in the chart. So all I'm doing, just like I had that data, you could see that it was 0100, 0200, 300, 400. I'm saving the date, time, and the amount transferred in arrays so that I can print them to the screen and so that I can print them in a chart. And here's what it looks like. I kind of cut it down a little bit so you can see it, but this is Traffic Edge. It's a much longer URL that's there. I've got my session token, which is CDNet's internal. I got my API key, which is www.cdnetworks.com. My from date, to date, time interval. You'll see all of that stuff kind of in the full script itself. And then, of course, output is JSON, as we all like. You can see I got the 0 return code, and then all the data comes back. But who wants to look at it in this format? I mean, if you're importing it into another mechanism, if you got something for billing or it's moving into different raw data or log analysis, you might want the raw data and you're going to do something with it. Other times, you might want to say, hey, let's just create a chart, and then I'll send a chart to myself. I don't want to look at the raw data. I want to create a chart. With the programming languages, it's super easy to do this stuff. Here's what it looks like in a Python chart. I've skipped a little of the importing stuff, but it's in the full example. Everything's up there. The labels drove me up the wall. I couldn't stand looking at 2017, 02, 01, 1700, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm going to create another array, a list. You know, Python, got to call it a list. Going to create a list called, I'm putting the word pretty at the end. So pretty, kind of like how you pretty print something. So now I'm going to walk through all of the dates and make them nice looking. So now all I'm going to do, if you could see the string, %s dash, %s dash, you know, so it's going to be year, month, day, hour. Just going to look much nicer. It was bothering me to look at without hyphens, so I decided to put that in there. I do some setup for the chart itself. I choose a bar chart, width, height, put in some nice strings up there, this, that, and the other. Add some labels, and the labels are going to be the pretty date time labels as opposed to the raw ones. If you didn't want the hyphens, you could use the other one and skip that. I'm going to export it to a file. I'm going to create and graph file, being all uppercase here. That's an indicator that it's on the top of the file. It's a constant. If you wanted to change that, you could go up there. Best practices probably would be to take www.cdnetworks.com and use it as a constant. I'm going to call this a bug because I fixed it in the version that's on GitHub. I noticed it later. But I'm going to save these as both an SVG and a PNG. PNG, everything can open that, right? And an SVG, this Python charting library that I chose, scalable vector graphics, it just does that. It only works nice in a browser, but it's very cool because it supports tooltips directly. So I exported both of them. And you know, if you're going to mail it to somebody, you probably want to mail the PNG so you don't have to open it up in a browser. But if you're using it for yourself, or you've got something really complex and you want these tooltips, use the SVG, and then as you highlight over items, you'll get individual details of exactly what was there. So you can see the exact data point, time, and value. And now if you scroll down or view down below, you can see 2017, 02, 01 all the way across. And it's much easier to read, so I'm very happy that I put the hyphens in there, and I think it looks much better. And because I follow all the rules, I'm going to do the logout command. but it took so long for me to create that darn chart that I got a 102. So this is the first time that I didn't get a return code of 0, and it's because I took too long and it timed out. So in this case, your session was already invalidated by the CDNetworks API servers, and you don't have to worry about it. It could have succeeded and it could have invalidated it. Here's the code. Yeah, it looks like everything else. I just print out the code result after sending in the token to invalidate. And this is what it looks like. I did take this screenshot earlier and did get the result code of 0. So in a big, huge whirlwind, something very long presentation here, I've kind of walked you through looking at a couple programming languages, looking at some data interchange formats, making a choice between what you want to use. On that, we've gone through a full example that shows, I mean, this is as complex as it gets. If you can do the Edge Traffic API, you can use the rest of the CDNetworks APIs, and you can use most other APIs from other enterprise vendors as well. For something like this, I encourage you guys to take a look at the sample source code. So I put it on GitHub under CDNetworks, and both scripts are there. I created a Perl version and I created a Python version. You have to, again, at the top of the file, put your username and password either in the file or, create those files themselves. And then I've got my email in the script as well as here on the screen. And look, feel free. I like doing this stuff. So if you've got any questions, if you're doing your first API and you've got some questions, you want to run something by me, just hit me up on the email here. Happy to take suggestions or questions on anything that we talked about today. And if you got any idea for future presentations, that'd be great. We'll probably post the presentations up somewhere to make them available. I did an XOR DDoS malware analysis a couple weeks ago, and so we might create an area where you can view all of the presentations. But at least the scripting example source code is available on GitHub CDNetworks, and I want to thank everybody for attending. Again, please reach out to me if you got any questions. I'd be happy to walk you through any examples or work with you on any API questions that you might have at all. All right, thanks again for attending. See you all next time.